Hello, geographers. We are back at it again tonight with our second lecture from the migration chapter. And tonight we're going to be looking at patterns regarding people's migration, where people are going, where people are coming from, and some of the reasons why that might be. So let's go ahead and dive right in with Ravenstein's laws of migration. Now, it's important to note that laws you see there are in quotation marks because these aren't laws like scientific laws where they've been tried and tested and proven over and over and over again. Instead, these are really more, like we just said a moment ago, patterns regarding migration. All right, and so let's take a look at it. Ravenstein, his name was E.G. or Ernst George Ravenstein. He was a British sociologist as well as a geographer and cartographer, living in England, living in Britain, right around the time that Britain was going through stage 2 of the demographic transition model. So keep that in mind as something that might have influenced these laws of migration. So first law of migration is that most migrants will only go a short distance. This is typically going to be internal migration. It's a great example of distance decay. So not a bad thing to write down out to the side. And if we were doing this in a traditional classroom setting, I'd be asking you guys, okay, how many of you have moved before in your lifetimes? How many of you are not living in the house that you were born in? Not literally born in. The house that your parents brought you home to. Anyway, how many of you are living in a different house, have moved at some point in your life? Then I would ask, how many of you have moved from a different state? How many of you have moved from a different region of the country, like East Coast? How many of you have moved from a different country? And what do you think would happen in the number of hands that we would see as those distances tended to increase? And hopefully you'd say that the number of hands would decrease, the amount of interaction would decrease. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Second law of migration is that if people do go a long distance, they're more likely to travel to a big city. This is a great example of what we call the gravity model. And we'll talk about this here in just a minute, but the bigger a city is, the more name recognition that it will have, the more people that it will have, so more chances for things like chain migration to be taking place. New York City is a great example of that. Just incredibly diverse city. So many different areas like Little Italy, Chinatown, that are products of chain migration. And so people moving to those areas because family members have been there, because of the name recognition. So if they are traveling a far distance, much more likely to end up in a big city. Next one is that most migrations are going to proceed in a step-by-step nature. Just by definition, that is step migration. But it also ties into Lee's model of migration that we talked about in the last lecture. That they're going to be intervening obstacles, intervening opportunities, and things are going to come up. The next one is that most migration is going to typically be from rural to urban. We've seen this. Our planet is now a predominantly urban planet. We have more people living in cities than in rural areas out in the countryside, and that is a product of migration to a certain extent. It's not the only factor in that, but that's a contributing factor. Every migration flow produces a counterflow. So the example I will use is just to build on law number 4 that we mentioned above. Most migration is from rural to urban. So when those rural dwellers move to the city, do the people that were already in the city stay there, and did the city just get bigger and bigger and bigger and nobody ever leaves? Well, no. Those city dwellers are going to go, oh, it's way too crowded now. And so I have to move out to the suburbs. So every migration flow, rural to urban, is going to produce a counterflow, urban to suburban. And so we're going to see that as a trend as well. Families are less likely to make international moves than young adults. I like to visualize this using the roots on a tree. The more roots that you have, the more challenging it is to uproot that tree or that plant. And so if you are a single young adult, you have fewer roots. And so it's easier to make a big move. It's easier to be uprooted than it is for someone that has a lot of family ties and things like that. And then finally, most international migrants are young males. So if you are going to make a big move, this is something that we can see represented in population pyramids. Remember, we looked at the population pyramid of the United Arab Emirates, how they had such a huge bubble on the male side right in the working ages. Well, this is a product of Ravenstein's law of migration, and so that's something that is a contributing factor here. Alrighty, now building on those laws of migration, we have to talk about a vocabulary term called migration selectivity, tendency for certain types of people to migrate. And again, this builds on what Ravenstein was saying, is that young people more likely to move than old people. Generally speaking, males are more likely to move than females, at least big international moves. Though that's why Ravenstein's laws are, air quotes, laws. They're not actually laws. Because even now, we're starting to see, especially here in the United States, about 40 to 60% of our international migrants are now women, joining family members that might have moved previously. And so we're starting to see some different things. And so migration selectivity is just the suggestion that we see certain patterns and trends, and that explains a lot of what this lecture tonight is going to be about. Most people migrate for economic reasons. Put a big, gigantic star next to that. In terms of push and pull factors that we talked about last lecture, economic is the biggest push factor. Well, push or pull, doesn't really matter. It's the biggest reason why people will voluntarily migrate. And we mentioned that last unit. But this is the foundation upon which Ravenstein built his laws of migration, is that all these different things are based largely on economics. And so in terms of push and pull factors, if you are going to a new location because you're trying to find a new job or better wages, well, those are going to be pull factors, whereas escaping poverty is going to be a push factor, pushing you away. And remittances are another one of our definitions. We'll look at it in class tomorrow with our top 10. Money that migrants send back to family and friends in their home country, often in cash, forming an important part of the economy in many developing countries. So, in other words, in place of developing, what other terms could we use? Could we use MDC or LDC? What would we use? How about core, periphery, semi-periphery? What would we use? And so make sure that you remember those different terms. So now let's actually take a look at the gravity model, which was the basis for that second law of migration, that if people are going to move a long distance, like an international move, they're likely going to end up in a big city. So let's take a look at this. And the gravity model, by definition, so you're underlining important parts of the definition, here we go. A mathematical prediction of the interaction of places. The interaction being a function of population size of the respective places and the distance between them. Size, or population, is directly related to interaction, and distance is inversely related to interaction. So, a couple things that we need to know here. The two factors that determine interaction, which for right now will be migration, but it can be any kind of interaction. It could be the amount of travel back and forth between two places. It could be the amount of emails sent back and forth. It could be trade. Any of these things are forms of interaction. So keep that in mind. But the two basics that we need to know in order to calculate the amount of interaction there should be are population and distance. And so that's how this is calculated. So here is the formula. Population of place number 1 times the population of place number 2 divided by the distance between them squared. And this is actually built on, or the premise is based on Newton's law of gravity, the idea that the more mass that something has, the greater the pull that is going to have. So for us in the migration unit, and we'll talk about this in other units, so this is something that you want to put a star next to. This is something that we will be coming back to. The gravity model predicts interaction. In unit number 1, we said that as a function of distance decay, as distance increases, interaction decreases. This explains why. And so it allows us to reasonably predict the amount of interaction between two places. Now, here's the reality. You're never going to have to calculate this on the AP exam, or I highly doubt that you would. But if we were to calculate it, it gives us essentially what I call an interaction coefficient. It gives us a number, and the higher that number, the more interaction in theory there should be. So you get two very big cities like New York and Los Angeles, and despite the fact that they have a huge distance in between them, there's going to be a lot of interaction because there's a lot of people in both of those places. Which is why if someone is making a big move, an international move, they're moving a long distance, where are they likely to end up? In a big city. Why a big city? It has greater pull. That's what this is about. And so gravity model, in many of its different forms, can be used to predict the amount of interaction between two places using just two pieces of information. And that is, again, population and distance. And so it gives us a way to predict interaction and predict patterns of interaction. So let's take a look at some of these different types of patterns that exist. So we have a couple different terms that we want to be familiar with. And this is going to move very, very fast. And so we just want to make sure that if you ever see these like in questions and things like that, you're familiar with these terms. So if we say intercontinental, it means from one continent to another. This was especially big like in the Cold War. There was a lot of talk about ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so there was a lot of concern about that during the Cold War. So intercontinental meant between one continent, from one continent to another. And during the Cold War, it was between Asia, specifically the Soviet Union, and the United States and North America. So that's what we were talking about. Interregional means from one region of a country to another. Intra-regional, and this is important, within. So if you ever see intra, it means within. Inter, it means between, from one place to another. You're crossing some kind of border, whether it's a border between two regions, a border between two continents. International, between two national borders. Intranational, just like intra-regional, would be within. Intranational, within a country. Intra-regional, within a region. And then we also have rural to urban, which we know, according to Ravenstein, is one of the great migration flows that we will be talking about. So now we're looking at specifically internal migration, so within a country. And these are just our textbook definitions, so this should be fairly simple, but we're underlining important parts of the definition. So again, intra-regional, people moving within one geographic region within a country, so within a region. And then inter-regional, people moving from one region to another, again within a country. Now, if we wanted to stretch this a little bit and talk about more than just internal migrations, inter-regional could also be international if the overall culture is maintained. So now we start incorporating a little bit of culture and we start looking at, okay, if you are moving from Saudi Arabia to Jordan, that could technically be classified as an inter-regional migration. Moving from one region to another, in this case Saudi Arabia to Jordan, so long as the overall culture is maintained. Now, obviously, there's some differences because, there's a difference between someone who is a Saudi national versus a Jordanian national. But we could say that the overall culture is maintained. There's obviously some differences. But this is where this class, where you have to be a critical thinker to really help break this down. Because on the AP exam, and really in life in general, you're going to be faced with a lot of really complex thoughts and problems and situations. And you have to be able to say, okay, what do I know? Let me break it down with what I know. And then say, okay, this is how it fits, this is how it doesn't fit. What does that mean? And so you really have to be a critical thinker about a lot of these definitions. It's not just straight memorization. A lot of this is critical thinking. That's really going to help separate you. So try and find good examples, counter examples, ones that maybe you're not so sure about. So we'll take a look at those as we go. A couple more definitions for us that would fall into internal migrations, or in this case, intra-regional, so within a region. So, couple new definitions, as always, we're underlining. Urbanization, the movement of people to and clustering people in towns and cities. Net migration from rural area to the urban city area. So in this case, this is going to be rural to urban. Urbanization is rural to urban. And really, I think that's the association you need to make. So like on your vocab assignment, that's the association you need to make. Out to the side of this, yes, we're underlining important parts, but let's shorten it down. Rural to urban, that's what we mean when we say urbanization. Suburbanization is going to be movement of upper and middle class people from urban core areas to the surrounding outskirts to escape pollution as well as deteriorating social conditions, whether perceived or actual, and net migration from an urban area to the suburbs in more developed countries. And this is typically where we're going to see this, and I'm going to tell you guys right now that we could actually replace in more developed countries, because really, suburbanization is something that is unique to Anglo-America, the United States and Canada specifically. Because in many other parts of the world, even in other more developed countries, the suburbs are going to be areas that are lower income, and you're not going to see the upper and middle class people moving out to the suburbs. But we'll talk about that in unit number 7. And so I want to make that point that this definition really kind of fits with the example of suburbanization as we see it here in the United States. And again, to a certain extent, in a couple other places, Canada, to a certain extent as well, Japan. So there are some other examples where this fits, but it's really a definition that is more characteristic of the United States compared to, say, Europe. This definition would not work in Europe. And so again, in this case, shortening it down, urban to suburban. And this is that counterflow that Ravenstein was talking about earlier. People move from rural to urban. So what's going to happen? The upper middle class people are going to move from the urban areas out to the suburbs. Now, the last one is counter-urbanization, net migration from urban to rural areas. Now, what's kind of interesting about this, and we'll look at some examples in class of this, but again, this is that reaction. So people that had moved out to the suburbs before, and typically moving out there for peace and quiet, more open spaces, whatever it is. As more urban people move out to the suburbs, those people that had been out in the suburbs move further out into areas that are classified as, guessed it, rural. And so that's where this counter-urbanization starts to happen. Once again, this is that migration flow to counterflow. And again, we're not saying that mom and dad now that they've moved out to the rural areas are going to move back into the cities again. But what we might see is that the kids growing up in the rural areas are going to go, you know what? I want to be in the city. And so the cycle begins again. And so every migration flow produces a counterflow, and that's a really interesting law to look at in real life. So again, some real life examples of interregional migration. And again, we mentioned that interregional could be international if the overall culture is maintained. But these are just some that would classify as interregional between regions in a particular area. So you can see the one up top between the Northeast, South, Midwest, and the West here in the United States. Some examples of interregional migration in Europe and interregional migration between particularly into Southeast Asia, particularly from China. Now, we talked about this with our 8 great modern migrations. And this, the bottom right there, is a perfect example. This is the Chinese diaspora. This is that large-scale out-migration from China. That was one of the 8 great modern migrations that we talked about. And again, remember when we said great, we weren't necessarily saying good. We were just talking like huge amounts of people. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Huge amounts of people leaving China, going to other places like Southeast Asia, like the west coast of the United States and North America. And so this was known as the Chinese diaspora. And so you can really see it in that bottom right example. Now this brings in the migration transition model. And again, this coincides with the demographic transition model. This coincides with the epidemiological transition model. So as we're going through this, I want you to try and draw similarities, comparisons across these different models, because we're going to have to on the AP exam. So let's start thinking about that now. So here's our definition. Change in the migration pattern in a society that results from industrialization, population growth, and other social and economic changes that also produce the demographic transition. So remember, what major event moved those core countries from stage 1 to stage 2? Started the process of industrialization. That's right, the Industrial Revolution. So that same kind of thing started the migration transition model. And we talked a little about this in chapter 2, but now we're going to get into the details of this. Name that you absolutely need to associate with the migration transition model is Wilbur Zielinski. It's a name that you're going to need to know. And what Zielinski said is that in stage 1, people are moving for food rather than for permanent migration. Now, this could be nomadic hunter-gatherers. It doesn't necessarily have to be, though. Really, we're not going to see a lot of migration. It's not a lot of permanent moves. When you're talking about, city-states and things like that, a lot of what humans lived in for a long period of time, we didn't see a lot of population growth until, about 1800 when we hit 1 billion people globally. And so there wasn't a lot of need to move permanently. So you didn't see a lot of people making those moves. And even the people that did, it wasn't massive numbers. So stage 1 really isn't characterized by a lot of migration. Very little migration. More characterized by, moving around for food and things like that. But not permanent migration, not moving to a different city or country and things like that. Stage 2 is when things really take off. Because, remember, in stage 2 of the demographic transition model, what changes? What happens? Because in stage 2 in the migration transition model, due to a high population and high population growth, we see a lot of out-migration. People leaving. They're going elsewhere. So where are they going? Well, they're going to stage 3 and stage 4 countries. And there is a certain hierarchy to this, because the stage 2 countries, and remember stage 2 we largely associated with the periphery, are going to go to either semi-periphery or core countries. Stage 3 countries, which we largely said semi-periphery, are going to be making their way to the core. So then what about the core? Well, again, we mentioned these are the destination spots for the stage 2 migrants. But again, stage 2 might go to stage 3 or 4, but we're also going to see some migration from stage 3 into stage 4. If we go back and look from the very first lecture, that net migration chart map that we looked at, we saw a lot of out-migration from Mexico. Well, where's Mexico going? Mexico's coming into the United States. And historically, that is true. And we'll look at a contemporary example of that here in just a couple minutes. But keep in mind, Mexico's a stage 3 country. And so they're leaving to go to a stage 4 country. They're leaving a lot of people going to the core. Same thing with Eastern Europe. Largely, I would say, part of the semi-periphery, stage 3. Where are they going? To Western Europe, stage 4. Now, what about the migration in Stage 4 countries, like, are people moving? Yes. By stage 4, most of this migration is going to be internal, and it's going to largely be intra-regional, and typically it's going to be cities to suburbs. And again, where is that most likely to be taking place? The United States, right? So we're going to see the kind of the exact opposite in Europe, but we'll talk about that later this year. We're seeing people move from the suburbs towards the city center. We'll explain why that is in unit number 7, but all of this is going to be tied together. Everything in this class is just, everything is connected. So let's take a look at some global migration trends. And so we can introduce another vocabulary term. So we're underlining again, migration stream, a well-defined migration channel from a specific origin to a particular destination. So things that have been established. And there's 3 major ones that we should be familiar with. And this is right now. We've got Asia to Europe, Asia to North America, and Latin America to North America. And so we can actually see that on this chart. The larger the arrow, the more data is represented. So if we were to ask, what type of map would this be? And you would probably say, it's a graduated symbol map, because the size of the arrow denotes the amount of data that we see. So this is looking at annual net migration. And so we're seeing about 500,000 people annually coming from Asia to North America. About another 500,000 from Asia to Europe. And so that's what we're seeing. So generally here in calculating net migration, remember net migration is the difference between out migration and immigration, so emigration and immigration. So we have more people coming in, so more immigration in Europe, North America, and Oceania. Whereas we have more emigration people leaving Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So if I were to ask you guys, is this map a good indicator of development? The answer is absolutely yes, it is. So can we see this in a particular region over time? And the answer is absolutely yes, we can. So let's take a look at Europe. A lot of times we like to do little case studies, whether through lecture or videos or readings, things like that. We want to have specific things that we can pull from to use as examples on the AP exam. So here we go. Europe, 1800 to 1920. What stage of the demographic transition model would Europe have been in at this point? 1800 to 1920. Crude death rate is dropping, population is soaring. So what stage is this? Stage number 2. So what this was, Europe was a source region for migrants. People were leaving. And I always call this the safety valve, kind of air quote, safety valve, because it's like a pressure release valve. As you get closer and closer and closer to your carrying capacity, that's putting more and more pressure to produce enough food and all this kind of stuff, you need to have a pressure release valve. And migration is just that. It's a pressure release valve. And that sounds really callous because we're talking about actual human beings and things like that. But that's essentially what this is that outmigration serves to bring the pressure down, give a greater gap between the total number of people and whatever the carrying capacity is. And so outmigration serves that point. So we see that a lot in stage 2 regions and countries, and Europe, in this case, was certainly in stage 2. So we see net outmigration, more emigration than immigration. And there are other factors as well. Things like, the Irish potato famine would have served to drive people away. Economic downturns in Europe, as well as job opportunities in the United States. Push factors, pushing people away from Europe. Pull factors, bringing people to the United States. Religious persecution would have pushed people away. Political instability would have pushed people away. And so in this case, we're looking at why were people leaving Europe at this time. And there's a lot of different reasons. Agricultural reasons, political reasons, and certainly demographic reasons. And that's what the migration transition model is all about, is looking at the demographics that cause certain migration patterns. So now, fast forward from 1960 to 2000, there was more in-migration. And to a certain extent, we can extend this beyond 2000 up to now, because this applies to Europe even to this day. The crude birth rate and crude death rate are very, very low. Life expectancy is very, very long. So there's a very large elderly population, what we call the grain of Europe. And so there's a lot of people that moved into Europe from other parts of the world, particularly from former colonies. So make that note out to the side that a lot of colonies, people were moving back to the former colonial powers. Even after the end of colonialism, after World War II, we saw a lot of people making moves back to the former European colonial powers. And we'll talk about why that is in political geography. But a lot of these guest workers came from areas that had been former colonies. So here's the definition of what a guest worker is. A legal immigrant, sorry, that kind of ran together. I want to make sure it's not illegal. A legal immigrant who has a work visa, usually a short-term work visa. Typically seen in more developed countries of Northern and Western Europe, where migrants usually come from Southern and Eastern Europe and from North Africa in search of higher paying jobs. Again, this is a product of the migration transition model, because Europe is now a destination region for many migrants. And to a certain extent, we can apply this to contemporary problems. When we look at the Syrian refugee crisis, so many Syrians were walking through Eastern Europe to get to Western Europe. And we could say, well, why? Why? I mean, they're getting further away from Syria, yes, but why continue walking through Eastern Europe to get to Western Europe? And it's so complex to try and pinpoint just a single thing. So we're not going to try and do that. But would this be a contributing factor? Absolutely it would. And so there's other elements that we talked about here. Germany, being a stage 5 country, was in desperate need of workers, so took in huge amounts of Syrian refugees. That's an example of the labor shortage that was there, as well as the fact that there were labor surpluses in areas. Now, we're not talking, no longer are we talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, because that was a forced migration rather than a voluntary one. And so in this case study of Europe, they're largely saying that it was a voluntary outmigration of people looking for better paying jobs, driven by economics, and there's a labor surplus in North Africa, because what stage was North Africa in? The countries of North Africa were in stage 2. They were approaching, if not over, their carrying capacity. So where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to the places where they're far below their carrying capacity, where there are a lot of available jobs in need of workers and working age people, especially with those late 4 and early stage 5 countries. And so really this is just a snapshot of what had happened in Europe over a course of about 200 years. And so to try and narrow that down to just 5 minutes in a lecture is really, really difficult, but hopefully we'd be able to use this if we ever had to provide examples about migration. Now, as far as U.S. immigration is concerned, there's 3 major phases that we need to be familiar with. First phase was during the time of the American colonies, and this was largely based on European settlement, which was mainly British, but to be clear, there's also some French and Spanish colonization of the areas that were controlled by the United States at that time, as well as we have to mention the African slaves who were brought over as part of a forced migration from Africa to not only to the American South, but also to the Caribbean and to South America as well. But in this case, we're just looking at the United States. The second major phase started in kind of the mid-1800s, and as these countries moved through the demographic transition model, as they moved through the migration transition model, we see outmigration from each of these areas. So Western Europe, first region to go through the demographic transition, we saw outmigration from there. Northern Europe, later, outmigration from Northern Europe. Then the beginning of the 20th century, so right around the turn of the the 20th century, that is the 1900s, we started to see Southern and Eastern Europe as that industrial technology diffused there, as they entered stage 2 of the demographic transition. And now the second half of the 20th century, we've seen a lot more from Latin America and Asia. Remember, those are two of our major migration streams even now, largely because of the population growth that's been taking place. Those countries, stage 2, stage 3 of the demographic transition, rapid population growth, and they need that pressure release valve. And so where are many of them going to go? Well, they're going to go where perhaps jobs are available, perhaps where there might be some pull factors of chain migration, economics, better paying jobs, all these different things, many of which bring them to the United States. Now, there are periods of decline as well. And we're going to look at this here in just a minute because you can visually see the decline in immigration associated with two major things. Economic downturns, like we see there, the 1893 Depression, the Great Depression, as well as wars. So make sure that you know the times that we see decline in immigration numbers associated with two things: war and economic downturns. So during each of these, the U.S. Civil War, the 1893 Depression, World War I, Great Depression, World War II, all these, we saw huge declines in the number of people coming into the United States. All right, so let's take a look at just one of those phases. In this case, looking at late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, of Northern Europeans migrating to the United States. In this case, it was Nordic migration to the U.S. So in this case, we're talking about Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark to the United States. And this is a link to a website, and you can actually go there. It's time-lapse, so you can click play and see the shapes change and things like that. Let's ask the questions that we always ask. First off, what type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we looking at? Dora's back. Hopefully you said that this was a graduated symbol map, because notice the circles vary in size. And then we also said subnational units or state units would be fine for the United States. Now, I want to draw your attention to the northern border states, because yeah, New York and California have very large Nordic populations, but we kind of expect that because they just have large populations in general. So relatively speaking, the northern border states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Idaho, they don't have as big a population. So why do they have such a large northern European population? And this was largely driven by chain migration, especially to Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those areas very much driven by chain migration. Previous Northern Europeans, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, Danes, moved to these areas, and so people moved to those areas. And part of the reason why they moved to this part of the country was because it was relatively sparsely inhabited. There weren't a lot of people living here at the time. And so many Northern Europeans moved to this area to avoid the persecution that many immigrants have faced as they came to the United States. And there's a lot of documented examples of that. But many Northern Europeans avoided that by moving to areas that were relatively sparsely inhabited. And so kind of a counterexample to the laws of migration, where if you're going to move a long distance, you're going to move to a big city. But in this case, they were moving to places where they knew people, so chain migration. And we can actually still see the legacy of this today, because there is a football team from Minnesota that shares a little bit its recognition to the large-scale Northern European migration that came to that area. The Minnesota Vikings are a great example of recognizing the cultural heritage of people in that area. And we're going to talk about that a lot, because I like to include a lot of those little pop culture references that are like, I never really thought about that, but it makes sense. Well, this is part of the reason why this makes sense. It's because so many Northern Europeans moved here, and so it's a little nod to the cultural heritage and the history of Northern Europe. So a couple different examples. This is actually from a released FRQ, so I'm not going to go over this a whole lot, but there's a lot of information here about different historical examples that would have served as push and pull factors. So I want you to go through and kind of identify ones that you are familiar with, that if this were an FRQ, because it was an FRQ, if you had been writing this, which ones would you have been really confident about? So maybe, put a circle around the ones that you would have been most confident about, and maybe put a question mark next to the events or the topics that you're a little less confident about, that maybe you'd want to do a little extra research on, looking into, because these are the types of things that students had to write on in the past. So these are the types of things that we as students might have to write on in the future. It won't be the exact same, but there are some similarities in different areas of the world. So I want you to take a look at this as to why different areas of the world migrated to the United States. So let's take a look at this graph, because this shows migration into the United States, and we can see all of the different phases that we were just talking about. We can also see a lot of our different the events that we mentioned, the wars and economic downturns. We can see those here as well. Now, a little note on reading this graph, because you will have to read and annotate it and mark it up for our study guide packet. It's a layered graph, so each layer kind of stacks on top of one another. All right. So the green at the bottom, and then you can see the yellow, orange, blue, red, purple. On top of it, they're stacked on top of one another. So that's an important note to read as well, that the layers below don't necessarily impact the layers above. So just because there's a giant spike in one of the lower levels doesn't necessarily mean that that giant spike will be replicated on the upper levels as well. And that it could be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So let's go ahead and take a look at this, because you can see the dip in immigration around 1860, right around the U.S. Civil War. You can see kind of the progression over time of different periods. Now, you can also see the dips: World War I, Great Depression, World War II. You can see all of those. Now, I want to draw your attention to the giant spike that's over to the right, because you can see it's kind of like right around the 1990s. And I want to tell you why that spike is there. And to do that, let's look at a different image. So now we can see what that spike is. The spike is labeled as the IRCA legalization. Now, to be very clear, on the last slide, it looks like there was a huge spike in immigration into the United States during like the late 80s into the 90s. But what this shows us is there wasn't a huge spike, and that big spike is actually due to a piece of legislation, the IRCA, which stands for, and you are absolutely going to want to jot this down, take some notes on this, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. That is Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. And essentially what it did was an attempt to try and control and deter illegal immigration into the United States by legalizing undocumented immigrants who had been living in the United States for a lengthy time, continuously in the United States since 1982, as well as legalizing certain agricultural workers, imposing sanctions, rules against or penalties for employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers, and increased enforcement at U.S. borders. That's what the IRCA did. So really, we didn't see a huge spike in people that came in during the late 80s into the 90s. Instead, what we saw is a huge increase in the recognition of people who were already here who weren't documented. So it was the documenting of immigrants who had come at some point and just had been continuously living in the United States since 1982, and now we're documented. And so that was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. And that's something that I think is a contemporary topic as well, because this is something that is still going on. The discussion of illegal immigrants and, you know, what's the best way to address the flow of migrants into the United States, both legal and illegal. And so that's something that's still going on, but it's something that the U.S. has addressed in the past with the IRCA. And so that's an important note to make. So this next image, and we'll move kind of quickly because this lecture has been going rather long, looks at migration to Mexico. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom left, because essentially what they've seen is that during 2 separate 5-year periods, we've seen changes in migration between the U.S. and Mexico. Between 1995 and 2000, we saw net migration from Mexico to the United States to the tune of 2.27 million people coming into the United States. But from 2005 to 2010, we actually saw net out migration from the United States to Mexico. Just 20,000 people, but still, that's net out migration from the United States. And so, is this a reflection of the level of development between these two countries? Because the kind of interesting thing is not so much a reflection of the United States, but certainly a reflection of Mexico. Mexico has become much more developed over the last 15, 20 years. And as a result, do we see changes in migration as countries become more developed? And the answer is unequivocally yes. And so this is something to consider, and maybe not even specifically for Mexico, but for really any country. As countries become more developed, are we going to see changes in migration patterns? And the answer is absolutely yes. And so how is that going to impact us here in the United States? How is that going to impact people in other countries? And so that's something to really kind of keep in mind. All right. This is the last slide for tonight. I know we've been going long, so thank you for bearing with me, but give me two or three more minutes and we'll be finished. This map was actually on the AP exam, which is the whole reason why I asked, what type of map is it? What scale are we analyzing? Because we might actually have to do that on the AP exam. And so when we look at this, this is a choropleth map county scale, looking at internal U.S. migration the years 2000 and 2006. Now, its choropleth map only has 2 classes. It has net in migration and net out migration. And students were asked to identify regions that had net in migration and net out migration. So, that's what I'm going to ask you guys to do. And we're going to discuss this in class tomorrow. So, brainstorm your answers. Then, once you brainstorm, circle the 1 or 2 that you feel most confident would have gotten you the points for both in migration and out migration. So real quick, brainstorm your answers for regions with net in migration. Brainstorm as many as you can, then circle the 1 or 2 that you feel most confident on. Now, brainstorm the regions with net out migration. And then circle those 1 or 2 that you feel most confident on, and you're going to bring those to class, and we're going to discuss that in class as part of our warm-up tomorrow. Have a wonderful night, everyone. I'll see you in class. Have a good one.